previsível incomoda quem tem a inusitude pulsando por dentro. Compreendemos que não é suficiente ser a transformação em si, mas sim fornecer o conhecimento para que daqui surjam indivíduos, grupos e negócios transformadores.
Com toda a pluralidade que ser só humano representa. O que os difere do resto das pessoas é a inquietude que existe dentro deles.
Foi de pessoas assim que nasceu a nossa história. Daqueles que passaram por aqui, já saíram e saem diariamente milhares de ideias que compõem nossa cultura e sociedade.
E entram em contato com a ESPM. Um nome só nosso para expressar o que provocamos em nossos alunos. Um nome para o que mobiliza nossos transformadores. A inusitude.
Afinal, o inusitado sempre foi antes posto à prova aqui. Ser transformador é praticar o inusitado.
ESPM, o inusitado em constante movimento.
Bom dia. Bem-vindos à abertura do Comunicom, nosso Congresso Internacional em Comunicação e Consumo. Eu sou a professora Gisela Castro, uma das professoras titulares do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação e Práticas de Consumo da ESPM São Paulo, e é um enorme prazer que eu apresento a nossa palestrante principal, a professora Saskia Sassen, que é catedrática de Sociologia da Universidade de Columbia, em Nova York. There you are. Hello, we're back.
Hello.
Now I'm introducing you, okay?
Yes. Yes.
Então, ela divide o tempo entre Nova York e Londres, onde ela também é professora visitante da London School of Economics. A professora Saskia tem uma trajetória bastante consolidada de estudos sobre as dimensões sociais, econômicas e políticas da globalização, as cidades globais, as tecnologias em rede e as transformações no Estado liberal provocadas pela situação atual da globalização e das movimentações humanas ao redor do planeta. Alguns livros da professora Saskia foram traduzidos para o português, sendo, dentre eles, Expulsões, Brutalidade e Complexidade na Economia Global, e também a Sociologia da Globalização. O livro mais recente foi lançado em 2018, Cities in a World Economy, pela Sage, lá de Londres. Sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra para a professora Saskia Sassen, que vai nos brindar com a conferência Globalização e Geopolíticas da Exclusão. Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to speak to you, and so I'm very grateful for the invitation. One way of starting is that I think I can't quite totally demonstrate it. I think we have entered a new epoch. And I'm talking mostly about the West. I'm not talking about China. But in our West, our big West, I think something has changed. In complex systems, it is not easy to establish that something has changed. It's not in your face. It's not like a war that destroys a city or a town. So what is it then, you might ask, that leads me to think that we have entered a new epoch? Now, this new epoch contains within it, of course, still much of the old epoch, of prior times, of things that may have been built 100 years ago. So when I talk about a new epoch, I am not talking about a change of everything. I'm talking about specific developments. And so one of these developments is a question of the border in a global world. We have done a lot of research, all of us have read about borders. So is there something about the current period where the border, the space of the border, assumes different meanings, becomes something else from sort of the traditional notion a border is a border, it separates two countries? Is the border actually now something that functions in a global world? These are all a set of issues I've examined at length. They can get rather tedious, if I may say so, rather boring. So I won't make you suffer too much on that end. But sort of that is one element. Second element, strategic spaces. We all know that our world is big. There are connections of all kinds with many, many parts of the world. But there are also these strategic spaces. And so the question then also is, what is the border in a global world? Because we have entered also a kind of globality. Of course, it is partial. It is not complete. Now, a third point that interests me is that we are seeing a change in our major cities. And well, there are many changes, but one change that has me curious is empty buildings. In our major cities, we are seeing more and more empty buildings. And nobody seems to do much about it. This then has led me to doing a kind of research on who are these empty buildings. And I'm talking mostly about really quite luxury zones. And so for instance, in London, you have a famous street of very, very rich and grand buildings. And many of those buildings are empty. The owners of those buildings live in many different parts of the world. It is clear also when you look at some of these luxury houses that are empty, that nobody has come into those houses for a very long time. There's one photo that became famous of a plant that clearly was left inside one of these luxury empty homes, and that grew through the ceiling, and so it became visible. And there it stands, a tree coming out of a luxury house. Now, the luxury house is a house, this particular house, that for a long time nobody has lived in. So it is a forgotten house, probably a family that was rich enough to forget that it existed and just, that it absolutely stands out. And those houses have rules. That means that they are still private property. The government cannot simply come and say, well, this house has not been used in 20 years. We can declare it useless and we can do something better with it. No. They can go on and on in this emptiness. You have a real sense that the owners, of course, were rich, that the owners owned many houses, and they sort of forgot about these houses in northern London, which is a very, very chic area of the city. And there they are. So that really intrigued me. And then, of course, it juxtaposes with that other condition that I work on, which is the poor and housing, where housing, any little amount of space, becomes critical. So we really have a variety, and I just mentioned two extremes: the luxury houses that nobody lives in, but that they clearly own, but they have forgotten about them, and so that hence you can just tell that nobody has been in those houses for a very long time. And then the housing of the poor, where there never is enough room, where every new child that is born, or new uncle or whatever, who has lost his or her house and hence joins the family, houses where the housing is increasingly insufficient, where people don't have enough room to add yet another child, yet another uncle who's ill, yet another, etc. So we really, the most extreme way of putting it is that on the one hand, we have extraordinarily beautiful, well-built houses that are empty, 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 empty. And I think I mentioned, all right, in one of those luxury houses, a tree became big and big and is now has crossed through the ceiling. And then on the other hand, of course, insufficient housing. So the question of housing, that we regularly tend to think that we have dealt with it. It's done. We don't need to go back to that. Well, no. But this is a very unusual element that I'm trying to add to the collection of particular modes in which the housing question has existed, in our life. Now, strategic spaces, that is another element in play. A city can contain strategic spaces for certain types of actors, of conditionalities, of enterprises, that the average citizen who lives in that city doesn't quite see. You just see the house. And as I said before, some of those houses are empty. And so the notion is they're a forgotten house, they are, etc. But in fact, there are also a lot of those houses that are not much inhabited, but that they play a very important function. And it can have to do simply with the fact that if you are in London, you can manage your money and how you want to protect your money and all of that in a way that is different from if you were living in New York or, in some place in Germany. So the reason sometimes, not always, sometimes, for buying certain types of houses in certain types of cities has to do with the protection for the rich of money they have, and that they can show, well, I have this money to take care of this house, so that the system, the system that controls all of this in different cities, in different countries, can actually accept, okay, this is an inhabited house, so everything is fine. Whereas in fact, it is not an inhabited house. It's an empty house, but it is a house that is functioning for the owners in a way that the typical police, the typical student of these subjects does not understand. And that is the notion that an empty house can be more important to make money than if you live in that house. Now, the empty house transforms in terms of the modalities through which nowadays we are able to manipulate the system of the money system. It's quite extraordinary. So here is a simple example, but there are less simple examples as well. I just want to make sure that is clear. So somebody buys a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood, very expensive, very chic, never lives there, almost never. So back to my example, the tree that was a little plant, now it turns out to be a tree, is growing inside the house, moving through the roof of the house, but the house is very well built, so it is still there. The plant just sticks out, the tree that is now a tree. And then the question is, okay, did they die and they forgot they have it, whatever? No. Owning a property, materiality, in other words, think of the property as being materials, walls, etc., etc. Owning materiality is what is in play. It's not about housing. It's that the house is a material condition that is recognized in every law system, in the many different ways in which our world considers the housing question. So the next question is, why do rich people who can own those houses but don't use them, why would they be interested in owning that house? They can just sell it. They would have all kinds of buyers. Well, and this is this very advanced mode that most people are not aware of, but when I began to discover it, a few years ago, I was absolutely amazed. Because the house is not functioning, as I said, as a house. The house is materiality. And materiality can be bottled on all kinds of entities, several times in a day. And every time you can make money. So you don't want people living in there who pay you the rent. No, you want that empty house so that you can use it. Buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. Because the buyers are also not interested in having the house. The buyers are interested in having access to a real property, to something that is recognized as having value. And in the chic neighborhoods, those buildings are recognized as having value, even if they are a bit broken down because nobody has lived in them, etc. The owner is who knows where in the world. Often they are foreign owners who simply forget or don't care anymore, or decide to pass it on to their children, and the children will sooner or later. Now, this, what I just described to you, sounds like it is some sort of strange mode of operating that is probably against the law, etc. No, it is okay with the law. It's quite amazing. Now you are beginning to have a movement that is objecting to enrich cities like London and a whole bunch of others. In Russia, you have the same thing in the big Russian cities. Begins to object to allowing these empty houses when there is so much need for housing by the more modest sectors of a society or of a city. And it is because noticing these empty luxury housing, empty where nobody was going to. With some of them, they were occupied, and some of them did have owners who came every now and then. But there were quite a few who were simply, you could just tell, nobody has been in that luxury house for years, not months, years. So the issue here is that the owners of those houses are not interested in the house. They're interested in the asset, something that is actually a material good in the case of a house, that they can then use to buy and sell, buy and sell, buy and sell in the same day, who knows how many times. Because it's not about the house. It is about an asset. Strictly speaking, an asset-backed security. This must sound to some of you like extravagant, preposterous, ridiculous, an abuse. An abuse it is. All the others, no, the owners of those houses are doing very fine, thank you. They may never go there, they may never really take care of it. That's not the point. The point is it is an asset. It functions as an asset. What we see with our eyes actually is functioning in the system as a very abstract but desirable mode of concentrating money and of buying, selling. Now, I'm giving you this simple description of how this works, but I'm hoping that you can see what I'm getting at. And the question is, to what extent is this spreading to other elements, to other constitutive elements of our daily life, of a city, etc.? In other words, is it the case that we have quite a few very wealthy, rich, whatever, to a very large extent foreign? And now I'm just thinking about the case of London, which is the most extreme case. It's also happening in the United States. It's also happening in some other countries of Europe. But this one is probably, London is probably the extreme case. London is famous. They actually have produced a map that shows grand mansions, none of them occupied, but they are owned. They're owned by a whole variety of people, including foreign buyers. So it is a very particular way of making buildings work for a profit that has little to do with the fact that it is a house. This is about, if you want, a materiality. It doesn't matter, and that is why it doesn't matter. They don't need to take care of the house. That empty house can stand there, like the one that I mentioned, where the tree had grown through the ceiling. It's been there for years. It grew. It cut through the ceiling, and there it is, in this empty luxury house that exists on a luxury street. It's known as a very famous street for the houses of famous people, etc., etc. In fact, there are quite a few who live there, but there are also these empty houses. I repeat, these empty houses are often the properties of actors who live abroad, who just wanted to invest their money in a safe something. High-level housing is one of those items, because this is really one of the richest neighborhoods, actually. So that gives you a sense of how our current period is enabling us, really enabling us to alter a lot of items that are familiar to us, to alter them a little or to alter them a lot. The case of the house that I'm talking about is an alteration of a lot, because the house ceases to exist. It's just a mountain of assets that can be bought, sold on the markets in one day, many times. It is not about the building, it is about that other action that takes place, for which you need a content. You need something that can be bought, something that can be measured. Well, a house will do that. Is the house empty? Doesn't matter. Is it occupied? Doesn't matter. Is it breaking down? Doesn't matter. You know, for some buyers, it just doesn't matter, because they are not about to live in that house. This is about having a materiality. That is really what it is. Something that you can buy and sell on the market. Now, some of you may be familiar with this that I've described. Most of you probably are not. This is a pretty extreme case, but it is also growing. Now, there are certain cities where the legislature is beginning to take notice and doesn't like it, especially when we confront also a shortage of housing, or that the prices of housing have gone super high, and there are all these empty houses that, if they could be used, would bring down the price of housing. So these are, and this is just one very extreme case, but I have a list of all the nationalities, mostly rich people from rich countries, who are buying those properties. And clearly, I mean, some of them, yes, will use them, but it is not about, having, this will be my summer house. No. It's really about this other vector that is in play. And I just think it is important for us all, we humans, to understand the extreme capabilities that are today in play to the advantage of the rich, because the rich have the capacity to use, these systems to hire the most brilliant minds to make it all work for them, etc., etc. It really is a pretty developed condition that is only doing better and better for the residents. Now, I don't know how much more time I have. If somebody could tell me, that would be good. But I wanted to touch on one other subject, which is, of course, housing and the poor. And one of my arguments, something that I have fought for very, very hard, is the notion that we really must understand that we must build more housing for the modest working classes and for the poor. We cannot allow what is happening in the United States in its major cities, be that New York, be that Chicago, be that Los Angeles, in all the major cities this is happening, which is that more and more workers, including, as I've already mentioned, women, are today who have had a job their whole life, who are still working very often, even though they are 72 years old or whatever. The only space where they can sleep is the street. Now, these are all people who, for their whole life, had a job. Then retirement time was on, and they suddenly had nothing. They just had a bit of money, their savings, but that was not enough for a house. So if you go to our major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco is famous for this, very visible condition. San Francisco is a small city, so it's very visible. You see at night older men and women, and it's not, as I said already, the old-fashioned, the drunkards. No. These are all working people, or people who have lost their jobs and do not have a job. But it is unbelievable that a rich country like the United States, in its top cities like San Francisco, like Chicago, like etc., that this is happening, that they are living on the street. They build little things with materials that they can use, or if they own, something that they can build a little protective zone with. And when you walk through those places, these people are very discreet. These are all people, most of them are people who had a job for most of their lives. And then suddenly there is nothing. And they feel shame. Luckily, they're now beginning to understand that this is a very broad spectrum of people where this is happening. And hence, the sense of, oh my God, we really, we are guilty of our own misery. They understand, no, we're not guilty of our misery. Our misery was an unfair deal that we were sold. Now, the United States, compared to, say, I don't know, the French or other kinds of countries, the United States is more brutal than, say, the typical country in Europe. I mean, not that they're saints there. They are not. There are no saints in this business. But so one stands back and one says, this huge country, the US, with all that space, and London a bit the same. They still have a lot of land that could be used to build housing for the poor. Let's put it that way. And the brutality of the system, that it keeps on allowing these abuses of power, and also, I would say, abuses of the city itself, because the city is not meant to have all these people at night on the street. It is for many of the older, modest income people, there is something aggressive, abusive, and negative about having so many people sleeping on the street. So they may not have solidarity with those people, but there is something about that condition that they find problematic. So it's not always that they say, oh my God, poor people, I'm going to help them. No, they don't. On the contrary, they can treat those older women and older men in a harsh way. But at the same time, they know that there's something wrong there, that this should not be happening in a city that has a lot of wealth, that has a lot of people who are perfectly fine in their housing, that's not necessary, those miseries. And again, if you look across the world, even in places where you would have least expected it, Japan, Tokyo, a perfectly designed city, serious, etc. Also there we have now older people living on the street. Now for the Japanese, this is a horror, this is a humiliation, but there's only so much that they're succeeding in repairing, let's say, in enabling those older people. So we can think of Japan and certainly Tokyo, etc., as an example of how to run a city that everything works well, everybody has access to transport, etc., etc. And then you have this other element also emerging. Well, the United States went through something similar. The United States at one point, certainly the big cities in the US, were fantastic cities. They used the existing technologies, etc., and now we have a lot of people living on the street in those. So when you look at it that way, you say, you know what, we have entered a new epoch, and this new epoch is charged with negative conditions, with abuses, with etc. Now, abuses have always existed in a city, poverty has always existed, but this is way beyond those levels. And at some point, the curve is sufficiently high that you can say, this is not simply the familiar, this is something different. This is new. We did not have this 5 years ago. Now we have these miseries where you have older retired women and also men, but the women are the more dramatic case, who worked their whole life, who assumed that their pension would cover them, and it didn't. They're on the street, and it's happening in LA, and it's happening in New York, and it's happening in San Francisco, and it's happening all over. And I want to leave you with that image. This is a profoundly distorted, one would say, outcome. Question is it a distortion? Or is this something that was in the making when we started to build in a certain way, when certain classes, modest classes, were a bit neglected, when the train system for those who travel, the poorer, was neglected? Is it an accumulation of neglects, of indifference, that has created some of this drama that I'm describing? I would say it is. It is not just that we have more poor people. More poor people, what does that mean? I mean, that's not what are we talking about? That doesn't fall from the sky. That poverty is partly made. And that is what we need to address this. This is for the future also of our children and our grandchildren. Something needs to be done, as somebody once said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor.
That was... And now I would welcome questions from the audience. If they can be forwarded to me by email, I'll be happy to pass them on to Professor Saskia Sassen. Well, in the meantime, you told us about London and some cities in the US, and this appalling situation of inequality and abuse, homelessness, and right next door to filthy rich people just simply ignoring huge properties that they own for the sake of it, right? For the sake of making more money. And so,
and it is really happening in many cities. Yeah. No, speak.
Yes, it's happening everywhere in the big cities, and it shows an inflection, a change, like you said, in the way current capitalist system operates, always favoring the filthy rich and simply ignoring those in the other end, the other extreme. And as more and more people join these ranks of destitute, poor people, homeless people, it reminds me of your book Expulsions, in which you talk about the brutality of this situation. Maybe you would like to speak a little bit more about the way people are forced to move away from their countries to find better living conditions elsewhere.
Right. You want me to talk a bit about that?
Yes, please. While I wait for
Okay.
the questions from the audience.
Yeah. Well, I think one issue that really emerged maybe 10 years ago or something was that a lot of people who were retiring discovered that what they had imagined they would have access to, it was not happening. And that sent quite a bit of shock, through several types of cities where you had a lot of also people who had serious jobs, who were knowledgeable, who discovered that what they expected would be the retirement situation was actually dramatically changed. So that's one item. And the other item is, of course, you have a lot of people who need housing, and you have a lot of empty houses. And the question now is also, and two cases have just emerged, do we also have empty, housing complexes? When you have these enormous towers full of housing, we're also beginning to see that those huge towers, houses that are in towers, sort of, there are also a lot of empty spaces there. And this is the kind of thing then that leads me to this other analysis that I gave you, that is that most housing is still simply housing, as we know it. But not all housing functions like housing. Some of the housing functions in a very different way. And the different way, as I said, is basically that it can be traded on the markets several times in one day, several times in an hour. So it is a tool, becomes a tool for certain actors. It ceases being housing, even though it still looks like housing, because the housing is the instrument that then some investors might buy, etc., etc. But what that investor does once it buys that big building, that is what we also need to see. And there you begin to see that it's simply, like I said, an empty house is going to can not always, but can deliver more profit to the owner than an occupied home. Because an empty house functions as an asset, an abstract asset that can be bought and sold several times in a day. That is a monster. That is the power of a monster. And that monster is not the house itself. It is something different. It is all those brilliant minds, the financiers that are buying and selling, in seconds, all kinds of things. That is what I object to, that our leadership in our cities, and this is happening in many parts of the world, that our leadership hasn't put a stop to that, saying, for instance, housing is not going to be something that you can put on the markets, where you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. Housing needs a special protection. Like I think for instance, Germany has it. Quite a few of the European cities protect housing because they know that that threat exists. That housing can be reduced to yet another asset. That nothing to do with housing. It's an asset. That is the baddie, if we might say, in the situation. It is that option.
Great. Yes, definitely. And Can you please tell us a bit more about the Committee on Global Thought that you co-chair at Columbia University?
Yes. Well, I mean, by now I have stepped out of that committee many years ago, but
Oh,
but
mhm,
Stiglitz and I
mhm,
started this
mhm,
years
mhm,
ago, and it was a way of opening a channel for all kinds of people interested in certain types of issues, and it really has worked very nicely. It had a period, where it really took off and was just great, and then it stabilized, and now it one almost forgets that it started out as a very original project. Not very, but an original project. It was different. It was a different way of inviting the academy to take it seriously, to take this issue of, I won't say it's not money, but it's the use of money, etc., to just enable your average college student or average professor, who's not an expert on this, to understand what was happening in the system, because the system was changing, because all kinds of new capabilities were emerging that were often original innovations, that were often a bit problematic, a mix, huh? But certainly a lot of innovation. The key point at that moment then becomes that the innovation begins to work towards favoring the financial system. And that was, of course, not the original idea. The original idea that we had, Stiglitz and I, was different, was to enable. But these barracuda knowledge zones that exist in our current world do very often lead to what you can discreetly sort of say, well, there's a bit of an abuse there. It isn't quite the original concept. The original concept was to enable the average person to maximize advantage, because they were very modest, because they didn't have many options. Survival was the most important thing. So how can we enable them? And well, we can enable them with all kinds of things, facilitating access to hospitals, giving them housing, etc. But we decided that also the question of money was something that mattered, and so out of that came that project.
thank you. There is another question here that is asking you to please ponder, if you can, on the increasing movement to criminalize, grassroots works or movements, protesting movement, housing movements, people in many different kinds of cities that occupy empty buildings, and how in your view can this be understood in this new dynamics?
This is very, very problematic, very disappointing. We thought we were at another stage in a way, and not back to this sort of grabbing by certain actors. Um, I do think that the new generation, the younger people, for whom the housing question, is often a far more extreme condition than what people like my age experienced when we were young, because everything was simpler. It was just a simpler world. There weren't all these speculative options that we have now. But the whole notion of the right to the city is something that I think it's an image, it's an idea, it's a possibility. We shouldn't give up on it. The right to the city means that even if you're poor, you can live in that city. You don't have to be a woman who lives in a tent after having worked her whole life for a firm that then let her go and didn't give her enough that she could stay in her little house. I mean, these are extreme conditions. So I have really made a long list of all these extreme conditions. One thing is inequality. One thing also is that the rich are rich and the poor are poor. But do we need to add more negatives, more burdens? No. What we need is to reduce those burdens as far as it is possible. Having total equality is out. The rich are rich and they'll stay rich mostly. And the poor are poor, and we hope that they can do just a bit better. We don't expect them to become rich, though some do wind up becoming rich because they're very smart or whatever. But what we're at now is an indifference. We now see homeless men and women who are, in their 60s and 70s. In other words, they used to have jobs, and now they can't afford to live in their flats because the prices have gone so high, right? I mean, that is unbelievable. And this started, we're now talking 10 years at least of this, if not more. When that first became known, many people were shocked. They could not believe that these people were simply thrown out onto the street, those people who had worked, that the enterprises who hired them, for whom they worked for years, if not decades, would just let them go like that. The brutality and the elementary, in the negative sense of that term, the simplicity, again, in the negative term, of that extreme condition, of that modus operandi, it is simply unbelievable. There should have been a revolution. Of course, we don't do revolutions anymore. But the other thing is that in many ways it was kept silent, rather than announcing, this is what's happening here. Are we going to allow this? Eventually movements came that confronted this reality. But still, most people, they stayed away from saying anything, probably partly afraid that they could also lose their housing. Because what happened was something that was a bit invisible, that in some neighborhoods, some of the poorer neighborhoods that had big, tall buildings where a lot of the low-income people lived, and it had been an arrangement that was reasonable. The government enabled it by paying partly. That then all gets captured by big firms who just want to destroy those old buildings and plant a new building. Because let's remember that we went through an epoch in London, in New York, in the German cities, in et cetera, where we needed housing for the rich and the well-off. More housing. And of course, that was a business that the business sector immediately jumped on. They said, hey, they need houses. Okay, we'll do housing. They need that. Oh, we'll do that. But certainly the housing bit. And the degradation of a process like building housing, because you could make money rather than because the city needed it, its people needed more housing. There is a kind of decay. Now, I think that the decay that I'm talking about also has to do with people being a bit at a loss, So, okay, yes, let's work on housing. Let's work on that. There is a loss of control on the part of the citizenry. That's one way of putting it. Big firms move in and do what they want. Certainly in the United States. I think it's different in countries like the Netherlands and Germany. They are far more controlled situations. But in the Americas, it is, what can I say? You've heard me say it. It's brutal. And that's it.
Thank you. There's another question here referring to your book, The Sociology of Globalization. In that book, nearly 15 years ago, you mentioned the new global elite. Would this that you're describing now be can this be understood as the deepening of this kind of global elites, the way they behave around? Can we understand this way?
Yes, there are certainly elements that are in play, no doubt about that. So you're right. Can it all be subsumed under that? No, I don't think so, because municipal governments are also guilty of not enabling poorer classes who are willing to put their money into building a house, etc., for their families. So it gets messier, but there certainly is a lot of that happening. So that's well put. Whoever said that was well put. But it's not the only. That's the most extreme case, and there are milder cases where it also is. It's not very effective for the poorer people.
Would there be a way for us to stop or to minimize this kind of appalling situation?
Yes, I think so. And I have in one of my books, there is some chapter where we have looked at several in the Americas, in South America, several instances where the leadership of a city really decided we must change this. And also in Spain, we had a very brilliant leadership for a while who insisted on upgrading the housing of the poor, providing housing for the poor, etc. But then all of that, then some fancier families move in, they add to the luxury aspect, and then those particular buildings are out for the poor again. This, as time proceeds, either the poorer buildings become poorer and less sanitary, etc., or they become more luxurious than they were meant to be initially. So it is a bit of a mess. But all we know is that people are now very aware of the housing question in a way that they were not 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Certainly not 10 years ago. Now people know that there are many people who had full-time jobs their whole life. They could not afford a room. They sleep on the street. I mean, it's shocking. It's just absolutely shocking. This is in rich countries, by the way. I'm not talking about poor countries.
Yeah, definitely. It's total shock. Well, do you believe that movements like the basic universal income or subsidized housing, do you think these kind of policies could help?
Yes, it helps. And if it spreads to a whole city or zone, that adds to the strength of it. You see, and I mean, there are simple and modest modes of intervening and making it better. But there is a kind of reluctance. In an earlier period, there was a kind of reluctance because thinking, okay, what if the drinkers, what do you call it, the ones that drink too much wine or whatever, if they come here, we don't want that, etc. So there were always these anxieties by families who were already modest families and wanted to protect the little bit of the positive that they had in those neighborhoods. So I can totally understand that. But it was a bit of a loss of an opportunity, a loss of time. The time went out. It was too late, when we finally sort of got it together. So it is. And of course, the transversal element, which I've written a lot about now, is that housing has become a very significant instrument for firms that want to make money. It's not about the housing per se. It's a more complicated routing. But construction and especially building good housing, is of great interest to firms where you would have thought, why would they be interested in that type? A housing that is not modest, but close to modest. Let's put it that way. Are we done?
I have nearly. I have one last question here, Professor.
Yeah.
About the right to consume the city in an unequal way,
Good.
This
Good
particular
point.
person is reflecting on the hygienization of poverty, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the right to exist in the streets of the person who is homeless. So,
right.
Do these people have rights, and how do you see that?
Yeah.
This is very critical in Brazil right now.
But this is a very important point, and we saw it quite a bit in some cities, also in the United States. I'm talking about, where the right to live on the street, like what I was describing, for these fancy like LA and San Francisco, where you have a lot of wealth, a lot of rich people, but you also have great climate, great options, and so many poorer people often go to a place like Los Angeles. And then the right to live on the street, especially because the climate is so much more benign, let's say, than what you would have in New York So this notion of the right to sleep on the street is an issue, it is something that is a live discussion, and more and more people recognize that if we are not building new housing for low-income earners and workers, because let's remember, they are working, they're earning money, but it's not enough. So that is the key point also for somebody like me, that the right to have housing, not because you are a human, but because by God you are working for a firm and you are saving your money, but you still cannot have housing, that the municipality, so to speak, besides other actors, can say, yes, that person is entitled to us supporting them because they are working, they are making money, but there is no way that they can pay for a house, to live in a house or in a room, or so absolutely that has emerged as a very important point of action, an important notion. Yes, we have that right, and many municipal governments support it. They don't have the money necessarily to do it, but they might try to persuade some others, but it is a tough battle, and it's a growing population of homeless. I mean, more people retire, more people will have trouble with housing. Now, there are a few cities in the United States, that are particularly poor, that are particularly low cost, but I mean, many of these people wouldn't even have the money. They don't know anybody. You can't ask too much from the poor and homeless. That is one way of saying it. And I think that will be my last word. And I like that as a last word, because I have to leave. I have to leave you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor. We're very, very honored that you could be with us, and we appreciate very much what you showed us and shared with us this morning. Thank you so much. Have a very nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you
really
so much on behalf of all of us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Professor. Bye-bye. And, well, folks, that's it. Muito bem, gente. Obrigada aí, todo mundo, pela força. Vamos continuar aqui com o Comunicom e a sua programação da tarde. Obrigada a todos pela assistência.